Chapter 8 is a chapter on the nervous system, but it also includes the special senses. And I've already have the lecture for the special senses in Canvas. So this is a separate recording on just the nervous system. So some functions of the nervous system is, number one, detection of internal and external changes. And receptors do this job. So changes is any kind of stimuli. So stimuli is any kind of change. So it detects these changes in trying to maintain homeostasis in the body. So a stimulus is any detectable change in an environment. Number two, analysis of the information received. So this is the control center does this. This is the brain and the spinal cord. So the entire central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. Number three, initiation of the appropriate actions. The brain sends this message out to effectors, which are muscles and glands. So the nervous system links sensory receptors and motor effectors, and the nervous system allows the body to respond to changes in the environment. Receptors detect the changes in the environment. So this is called the stimuli, and in turn, of course, it turned into like electrical impulses to affect different parts of the body. So we've always said that the nervous system is the granddaddy of all systems. So it is responsible to sending neurons and nerve impulses to every part of your body for every part to work accordingly. Two divisions of the nervous system is the central nervous system, which is comprised of your brain and spinal cord, and this is your control center. And it receives information from and sends information to the peripheral nervous system. So the brain processes and interprets information sent from the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, this is the nerves outside the central nervous system, carries impulses formed by receptors to the central nervous system and then carries them back out to effectors, which is our muscles and our glands. So two types of cells in the peripheral nervous system. These cells carry information to and from the central nervous system. Some classifications of your peripheral nervous system. You have sensory or afferent division. This is nerves that carry impulses to the central nervous system. You have motor or efferent division. This is nerve fibers that carry impulses away from the central nervous system. And there are two subdivisions of the motor division. You have the somatic nervous system and you have the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is your voluntary responses from your skeletal muscles, what you voluntarily do. Secondly, your autonomic nervous system is your involuntary, that you have no control of, responses from your smooth muscle, that's your cardiac muscle and your glands. So the autonomic nervous system is involuntary, such as the beating of your heart or the widening or narrowing of your blood vessels. So when something goes wrong in this system, it can cause serious problems like blood pressure problems, heart problems, trouble breathing or swallowing, or even erectile dysfunction in men, because all of that deals with the smooth muscle or the cardiac muscle, which you have no control of. It's involuntary. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions. We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is your fight or flight. This takes over to increase activities activated during exercise, excitement, emergency, or embarrassment. So this is continuously active to maintain stability, temperature, and pH of your body. It uses nerve pathways in the body to initiate reactions in the body, and the hypothalamus tells the system to kick into gear. The body speeds up, tenses up, and gets alert. So all of this, when you get alert in an emergency situation, it sends impulses to tell the epinephrine or your adrenaline to be released in your blood from the adrenal medulla. So this is your stress hormones. This is what causes your blood pressure to go up and your heart rate to go up. Then the parasympathetic is your resting and digesting, concerned with normal digestion, elimination of feces and urine, and with conserving body energy. So this is your housekeeping system. This is responsible for the body's ability to recuperate and return to a balanced state known as homeostasis after pain or stress. So the vagus nerve, known as the cranial nerve 10, when it's active, it slows down the heart rate, dilates blood vessels, and stores energy back. So you're recovering back from going through your fight or flight in your sympathetic nervous system. So a nerve tissue, a neuron, is a delicate cell that is specialized to transmit neural impulses. They are the structural and functional unit of a nervous system. So some major regions of your neuron is your cell body, and this contains your nucleus and all other organelles except for centrioles. And then you have processes that are fibers that extend from the cell body. So a neuron is it is an electrically excitable cell that processes and transmits information through electrical and chemical signals. Neurons are the core component of the nervous system. Your cell body, remember, is the largest part of a neuron and contains the neuron's nucleus, associated cytoplasm, and other cell structures. Produces proteins needed for the construction of other parts of the neuron. And then your processes are finger-like projections from the cell body that are able to conduct and transmit signals. Axons carry signals away from the body. Dendrites carry signals toward the body. The nerve tissue, we have dendrites, and dendrites are numerous neuron processes off the cell body that receive incoming stimuli. So they are short branched processes extending from the cell body that conduct impulses toward the cell body. They conduct the electrochemical stimulation received from other neural cells of the cell body. Neurons have thousands of dendrites. It is the dendrite that receives the bulk of nervous signals from other neurons. Then we have an axon, which is known as a nerve fiber. This is a long, thin process that conducts impulses away from the cell body. Conducts electrical impulses away from the neuron cell body, and it is the longest axon in the body are those in the sciatic nerve, which run from the base of the spine to the big toe of each foot. The nerve tissue, continuing here, we have the myelin sheath. This is the outer insulating covering of the axon formed from neuroglial cells. Neurons that have a myelin sheath conduct impulses faster. So the myelin sheath is an insulating layer that forms around nerves, including those in the brain and spinal cord. The purpose is to allow impulses to transmit quickly and efficiently along the nerve cells. If this is damaged, impulses slow down. This can cause diseases such as multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease that affects the brain and spinal cord. A virus or of any type of thing like a virus can cause loss of balance or problems walking, tremors, that type of thing, because it damages the myelin sheath. The nodes of Ranvier, these are tiny spaces between the myelin sheath where the axon is exposed. Soft story conduction. This is the process by which an impulse jumps from node to node on the myelin sheath, which allows for that fastest conduction. And fastest conduction, I'm talking about the nerve impulse reaching parts of your body to control you walking or doing a task of some type. Because we know someone with multiple sclerosis might have a weaker days or less strong days where they can't do as many things because of that. Again, it all deals with the nervous impulses reaching your body. The axon terminals, that's just simply the end of the axon, and a synaptic knob is the enlarged tips at the axon terminal. Types of neurons, we have sensory, or known as afferent neurons. These carry impulses from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Cell bodies are located outside the central nervous system in clusters called the ganglia. So the sensory neurons converts external stimuli to corresponding internal stimuli. They convey sensory information to the brain or spinal cord. These neurons are activated by physical conditions such as light, sound, heat, smell, and taste. Your interneuron is located entirely in the central nervous system and functions to process and interpret impulses received from sensory neurons. So they form connections between other neurons. Your motor or efferent neurons carry impulses from the central nervous system to effectors. That's your muscles and your glands, cell bodies in the central nervous system. So they project their axons outside the central nervous system to directly or indirectly control muscles. They carry signals from the spinal cord to the muscles also to produce movement. Neuroglia, this is supporting cells. So we have astrocytes, abundant star-shaped cells that brace neurons and form barriers between the capillaries and neurons for protection. These are found in the brain and spinal cord. They are the most abundant cell of the human brain, and they provide support, provision of nutrients to the nervous tissue, maintenance of balance, a role in the repair and and scarring process of the brain and spinal cord following maybe like traumatic injuries. So your astrocytes help to repair that scarring process of the brain. Microglia, this is spider-like phagocytes, and they dispose of debris. They act as the first and main form of active immune defense in the central nervous system. When these are activated, an inflammation process in the central nervous system occurs, which leads to play a very important role in the pathway leading to cell death in a number of neurodegenerative diseases, including things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis. Ependymal cells line cavities of the brain and spinal cord circulate cerebrospinal fluid. They produce cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system. They have tons of cilia that assist in the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. They provide neural stem cells for brain regeneration, and it is a common source of brain tumors. We have oligodendrocytes produce the myelin sheath around the nerve fibers in the central nervous system. These are myelinating cells of the central nervous system. They provide support and insulation to the axons in the central nervous system. They form the myelin sheath, which is the insulator of axon segments, and assist in nerve conduction rate. Then we have the Schwann cells that form the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. This is a glial cell that wraps around the nerve fiber in the peripheral nervous system, and they form the fatty material called the myelin to insulate the axons in the peripheral nervous system. And this is just the neuron anatomy. The cell body contains the nucleus, one or more dendrites, and a single axon that is an extension from the cell body. So remember, the neuron is the basic building block of the nervous system, and it is specialized to transmit information. So your nerve impulse has some properties. It has irritability and conductivity. So irritability is the ability to sense and respond to stimuli, and conductivity is the ability to transmit an impulse. So neurons are highly irritable and excitable. That means they're responsive to stimuli. Remember, stimuli means any change in the environment. When a neuron is adequately stimulated, an electrical impulse is generated and conducted along the length of its axon. This response is called the action potential or nerve impulse. It is always the same regardless of the source or type of stimulus, and it underlies virtually all functional activities of the nervous system. So your nerve impulse occurs in several steps here. So an unstimulated neuron uses the sodium-potassium pump to actively pump sodium out and potassium ions in. This results in more positive charged ions outside. Then an unequal distribution of those electrical charges on each side of the plasma membrane is called the resting potential. So at rest, the plasma membrane is polarized. So that means there's more positive ions outside the cell and more negative ions inside the cell. So when stimulated, neurons exhibit an all or none response. So they either form an impulse or they do not respond. So also, you need to understand that the plasma membrane is more permeable to potassium than sodium. So potassium diffuses out of the neuron. Large negatively charged proteins and ions cannot diffuse out of the neuron. This results in a net excess of positive ions outside the neuron and an excess of negative ions inside the neuron. So the polarization of the neuron membrane does not change as long as the neuron is inactive. In order for an impulse to be generated, the charges outside and in must swap. Sodium will then enter and potassium leaves. So when stimulated, neurons exhibit that all or none response, and there's no such thing as a weak impulse or a strong impulse. They're all the same. So there can, however, be a difference in the stimulus known as a weak stimulus and a strong stimulus. The weakest stimulus that will activate a neuron is called a threshold stimulus. The nerve impulse begins when a stimulus occurs. The stimulus causes the plasma membrane to instantly become very permeable to sodium. Sodium floods the cell and causes the cell to become positively charged. This is depolarization. Depolarization of the cells initiates an action potential or an impulse. Immediately after depolarization, potassium channels are going to reopen and the sodium channels are going to close, allowing potassium to diffuse out to reestablish the resting potential, so more positive ions outside than inside. Now this process is called repolarization. So with sodium still inside the cell and potassium now outside the cell, the sodium-potassium pump is used to reestablish the resting state distribution of an ion. So sodium's outside and then potassium's inside. Now keep in mind, everything that we've just studied about a nerve impulse formation all takes place in about 1/1000th of a second. That is what happens for you to have a nerve impulse to tell you to speak, walk, write, whatever action you can think of. You have to have blink, swallow, everything has to have a nerve impulse. Synaptic transmission. We have the synapse. This is the junction of an axon with either another neuron or an effector cell, a muscle or a gland. And the synapse information from one neuron flows to another neuron across the synapse. The synapse are essentially, they're very essential to neuron function. The synaptic cleft is the tiny gap between adjacent neurons. This is the space between the neurons at a nerve synapse across which a nerve impulse is transmitted by a neurotransmitter. The synaptic knobs at axon terminals contain vesicles with neurotransmitters. And remember, we talked about neurotransmitters a little bit and in the previous chapter, but these are chemicals that cross the synaptic cleft to stimulate an adjacent neuron or an effector. Protective coverings of the central nervous system. The organs of the central nervous system, remember, is the brain and the spinal cord, and these are covered by 3 connective tissue layers called the meninges. These are the structures involved in meningitis, which is an inflammation of the meninges, which is a severe inflammation of the brain. And we have the dura mater, that's the tough, fibrous outermost layer. This can restrict movement of the brain. We have the arachnoid layer. This is the middle web-like layer. And we have the pia mater. And the pia mater is the innermost membrane attaching to the brain. Now the dura mater, this protects the brain from movements that may stretch and break even brain blood vessels. And that's just a photo depicting all the 3 different layers. And this is the same. This is your vertebrae, and this is just showing how you have the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater in the middle of each vertebrae. Ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. So you need to understand that we have ventricles, which are 4 cavities within the brain lined with ependymal cells and are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. You have the choroid plexus, which is a mass of specialized capillaries in each ventricle that produce cerebrospinal fluid. And then the cerebrospinal fluid is the watery cushion formed from the choroid plexus that protects nervous tissue found within the ventricles. This is the central canal of the spinal cord and the meninges. So the entire surface of the central nervous system is bathed by a clear, colorless fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid is contained within a system of fluid-filled cavities called your ventricles. And ventricles are the communicating network of your cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So your ventricles absorb physical shocks to the brain. They distribute nutrient materials to and removes waste from nervous tissue. They also provide a chemically stable environment. And then we have 4 regions of the brain to discuss. We have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So we'll get into the first one, the cerebrum. This is the largest portion of the brain, performs higher brain functions involved with sensations, voluntary actions, reasoning, planning, and problem solving. The cerebrum consists of 2 hemispheres, the right and the left, joined together by a mass of neuron processes called the corpus callosum. So remember, this is the largest part of the brain, most highly developed part of the brain, and it determines our intelligence, our personality, our thinking, our perceiving, producing and understanding language, interpret sensory impulses, motor function, planning and organization, and even touch sensation. The surface is described as convoluted because it has the numerous folds and grooves. So the gyri is the ridges, the sulci is the shallow grooves, and the fissures are your deeper grooves that divide the cerebrum into lobes. So the surface of the cerebrum is composed of gray matter. That's unmyelinated fiber and is known as the cerebral cortex. The white matter is myelinated fibers composes most of the cerebrum with several masses of gray matter embedded deep within. Your lobes of the cerebrum are the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and the frontal lobe. So you have 4 different lobes here, as you can see in the picture of the cerebrum. So some functions of the cerebrum, you have hemisphere specialization. So in most, about 90% of people, each hemisphere is specialized to perform different functions. The left hemisphere is specialized for analytical and verbal skills such as math, reading, writing, and speech. The right hemisphere controls musical, artistic, imagination, and insight. In some people, this specialization is reversed, and in others, there may be no specialization at all. The diencephalon, so within the cerebral hemisphere, sits on top of the brainstem. We have the diencephalon that's made of 2 major regions. We have the thalamus, that's the relay station for sensory impulses passing to the sensory cortex, provides a general but non-specific awareness of sensations such as pain, pressure, touch, and temperature. Hypothalamus is the major control center for the autonomic nervous system. It controls all internal organs and is the connecting link between the brain and endocrine system. It regulates body temperature, water and mineral balance, appetite and digestion, heart rate and blood pressure, sleep and wake cycle. So this relays sensory information between the brain regions and controls many autonomic functions of the peripheral nervous system. Talking about the diencephalon here. So it also connects structures of the endocrine system with the nervous system and works in conjunction with the limbic system structure to generate and manage emotions and memories. It directs sensory impulses throughout body. So this helps to control our homeostasis. Hearing, vision, smell, taste, touch, several things that it helps to control. The limbic system, composed of parts of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and deep matters of the cerebrum involved in memory and emotions. And mood disorders such as depression are usually a result of a malfunction of the limbic system. So emotions and motivations, mostly those related to survival, also involved in the feelings of pleasure that are related to things such as eating, also involved here in the limbic system. The brainstem attaches to the spinal cord, and we have the fact that the brainstem is the region that connects the cerebrum to the spinal cord. It's coordinated motor control signals sent from the brain to the body, controls life-supporting autonomic functions of the peripheral nervous system such as alertness, arousal, breathing, blood pressure, digestion, heart rate. So you have the midbrain that contains the reflex centers for the head, eye, and body movements in response to visual and auditory stimuli. You have the pons, which works with the medulla oblongata in the control of breathing. And then you have the medulla oblongata, which is linked with the spinal cord. This is where ascending and descending fibers between the brain and the spinal cord will cross over. You have the fact that the medulla contains 3 control centers vital for homeostasis. Your respiratory control center works with the pons to regulate the depth and rate of breathing, contains reflexes for coughing and sneezing. You have the cardiac control center, regulates the rate of heart contractions. And you have the vasomotor center, which regulates blood pressure and blood flow by controlling the diameter of blood vessels. The cerebellum, this is also known as the little brain. It controls movement, coordination, balance, equilibrium, and even muscle tone. So it coordinates skeletal muscle activity that controls your posture, your balance, and your coordination. And that coordination reaches to the inner ear. And so like if someone has an ear infection, this is what makes like a child fall down a lot and be dizzy, or even an adult, because it's connected to the cerebellum, which deals with your coordination and your balance. The peripheral nervous system is the cranial and spinal nerves outside of the central nervous system. So a nerve remembers axons and dendrites that are bundled together by connective tissue in much the same way as a muscle fiber. So neuron fibers are bundled by connective tissue. The endoneurium surrounds the neuron. The perineurium surrounds a fascicle of neurons, and the epineurium surrounds many fascicles outside of the neuron. Then you've got the classification of nerves. We have mixed nerves. This is both sensory and motor. All spinal nerves are mixed. You have afferent or sensory nerves. This carries impulses toward the central nervous system. And afferent detects stimuli and conducts nerve impulses back towards the spinal cord and up to the brain. This is the body's way of attaining awareness of its outside environment and making sense of it. So we need to understand the direction in which they carry the impulses. So afferent is carrying impulses toward the central nervous system. Efferent is motor nerves, and this is carrying impulses away from the central nervous system. They facilitate motor nerve impulses from the brain down through the spinal cord and out to the intended area of movement in the body, such as your muscle or your organ. Nerves, we have cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs of nerves that mostly serve the head and neck. Most are mixed nerves, but three are sensory only. So we have spinal nerves. There are a total of 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they're all mixed, and they emerge from the spinal cord. So emerging directly from the brain, your cranial nerves, in order for them to reach their targets, they must enter the cranium through openings in the skull. They send their axons out of the cranium where they will ultimately control muscle, such as your eye movement, salivary glands, heart or stomach muscles. So they are the means by which the brain receives information from and controls the functions of structures located in the head and the neck. You have a reflex. A reflex is a rapid, predictable, and involuntary response to stimuli. Your reflex arc is the reflex pathway. This is the direct route from a sensory neuron, the interneuron, to the effector. And then you have a simple reflex arc consisting of sensory neurons, integration center, and a motor neuron. And then you have your second neuron reflex is your knee-jerk reflex, and then the third is your withdrawal reflex. And then we have inflammatory disorders. I'm not going to read all of these for you. It's just strictly definitions. But for the next several slides is inflammatory disorders and non-inflammatory disorders. So we've got neuritis, sciatica, shingles. And then on non-inflammatory disorders, we have Alzheimer's, cerebral palsy, cerebrovascular accidents, also known as your CVAs or your strokes, coma, concussion, dyslexia, epilepsy, and fainting. Headaches, such as migraine headaches, mental illnesses such as neuroses and psychoses, multiple sclerosis, neuralgia, paralysis, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the next part of the chapter, the next half of this chapter is dealing with your senses. And you'll notice I'm not going to do any recording of lecture on the senses because in your modules where you'll find this video, there are individual videos on senses discussing this chapter. So go and refer to those individual sensory videos to finish out the lecture for this chapter.